Hello and welcome to TheFIX, a podcast about Lightroom, Photoshop, post-processing, and the cool and creative things we get to do with our images after the shoot. I'm your host, Sean Duggan, and this is episode 84. On this week's show, we're going to revisit the steampunk radio composite from episode 81, and we're going to combine that with two different video clips to explore some of the ways that you can do video compositing in Photoshop. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in and joining me. I do appreciate that. So as I mentioned in the intro segment, today's project is the culmination of a project that was begun 3 episodes ago. We're going to take the steampunk radio from episode 81 and we are going to integrate it into a video clip to create a video composite in Photoshop. And taking it even a step further, or a couple of steps further, we're going to modify that still composite so that we can add in an additional second or third video clip into that to sort of bring life to some of the faceplate elements of that steampunk radio. So, the cool thing about working with video in Photoshop is that you can take some of the things that you probably already know about Photoshop if you've been using it for a while, like working with selections and layers and layer masks and things like that, and you can easily apply that to video projects and kind of get up and running a little bit quicker. So I think it's pretty cool that you can take an existing skill set that you may have in a program and then extend it into different areas of the program that you have not been working with before. So that is what's on tap for today as we take our steampunk radio from a few episodes ago and convert it into a steampunk television or a steampunk video monitor. But before we get to that, I have an announcement to make. This is going to be my last appearance as the host of TheFIX. I've been hosting this show for a little over a year now. I took over from Jan Kabili, the original host of TheFIX, in the first half of September in 2015. And during that time, it has been a great ride. I've had a wonderful time. I've learned a lot. I've met a lot of really interesting people. And over the course of the 54 episodes that I have done, I've really enjoyed bringing to you, the viewers and listeners, a variety of different guests each week to talk about a range of topics related to post-processing and Photoshop, Lightroom, mobile apps, plugins, backup strategies, etc. Really has been a great experience overall. And one of the best parts actually has been hearing from the viewers and listeners from all over the world through comments on the show's page or Facebook comments to my Instagram, or even a few times just being approached at trade shows by people who recognize me from here on TheFIX. So that's been a really great experience, very, very rewarding. But, after doing this for a year every week, it's just time for me to move on and pursue other creative projects. And I'm looking forward to having a little bit more time and attention to devote to some big projects that are kind of currently percolating on the sidelines. I also want to give a big shout out to Frederick Van Johnson, the founder of This Week in Photo, and thank him very much for the opportunity to serve as the host of this podcast for the past year. It's been a really great experience, and I really, really appreciate that. And the TWiP network has a lot of really excellent podcasts, and if you haven't yet checked them all out, you definitely should do so, because there's a lot of great podcasts on a range of different topics, hosted by some very, very talented people. So it's a great resource and it's there for you. So, might as well make the most of it. As for the THEFIX, it's going to be going on hiatus for a little while, but it will be back in one incarnation or another, and I look forward to seeing what they do with it. I'm sure that, as with all of the other podcasts on the TWiP network, it will be excellent, and I urge you to stay tuned for news on that. And as for me, well, you can always find me at my website, SeanDuncan.com. There's buttons there for the usual social media channels where I hang out. And you can also find me over at lynda.com, where I've got a lot of courses there as well. But for now, it's time to dive into our project of the day, which is to turn that steampunk radio into a steampunk television, courtesy of some video compositing skills in Photoshop. Let's get going. All right, before we get into the video compositing part of this project, I want to review where I left off when we last worked on this project, or when I last worked on this project, which was about 3 weeks ago at the end of episode 081. So this was the composite as I had finished it in the episode, and just to review what's going on here, if I turn off some of these layers here, we can see that I started with a photograph of a cover of an old dictionary from around the turn of the century, stretched it out, did some retouching to make it fit into a more rectangular format, and then began adding in elements from different photographs of old radios and old electronic gear to create this look of this strange, funky radio faceplate panel. And then the kind of three-dimensional aspect was created by a layer mask on this cover panel layer, this kind of leathery cover there. And you can see that if I turn that on and off, you can see the three-dimensional bevel and emboss effect showing up there. And that again is created with a bevel and emboss layer style on this cover panel layer. And because the layer has a layer mask on it that is making some areas of that layer transparent, the bevel effect is showing up there on those edges. So that's where I was when I left off at the end of episode 081. But as is frequently the case, sometimes when I start a project like this on one of these episodes, I tend to take it a little bit further. So by the time the episode aired, I had done this to the composite. And what I want to do now is I just want to go through and show you what I did. I'm just going to do a quick deconstruction of some of the layers that I added here to give you a better sense of how I put this together here. All right, so this is the merged version up here I've got at the top. Let me just turn that off so we can deconstruct what's going on. And this is, again, how I left it at the end of episode 81. So the first thing that I wanted to do is bring in, some sort of other case. I wanted to make it look like it really was enclosed in some sort of a case that might house a radio or something. The rough edge book cover look here works very well with how I'm going to use it in the video in a little bit. But I just wanted to play around and do something a little bit different. So I added on a case, and I made the case out of this old Kodak folding camera. So this is the basic Kodak camera case here. And then I have a layer mask up here on the layer group. So that all of the layers that make up the case here are in one layer group. Currently I have that layer mask turned off. And you can turn a layer mask on and off by just shift clicking on the layer mask thumbnail. And it's just a toggle. It'll turn it on or off. So you can see here that that layer mask is masking out that center part, which is letting the original radio composite show through from underneath. And then I did several other things to make this look a little bit better. Added some shading there to make it look like that radio was kind of inset into the case. Added in some additional details. This is part of an old accordion that I added in here. And I darkened down the left side a bit. I added in a handle on the top, and that handle is in its own little layer group here. You can see it's comprised of 3 layers plus a curves layer to darken that down. So there's the handle. And what else do we got going on in here? Oh, the speakers. I added speakers because, of course, a radio has to have speakers. And the three-dimensional aspect there that you see, the shading and the bevel effect, is created by the same technique that I used to create the inset effect on the main radio panel. Again, just a bevel and emboss layer style on top of a layer with transparent areas, and that's where that bevel and emboss effect is showing up. All right, so that's the speakers. Let's see what else we have here. Let me actually turn some of the background layers on so we can see what I did in the background. And I actually copied the bottom part of a photograph of the same case on a table and put it there. And let's adjust that. I felt that the light was coming in from the left side of the image, so I needed a little bit more brightness on the table there to make that a little bit more convincing. And then finally I have a shadow up here that I added. And that layer we don't need. So that's basically what I did to create that additional composite. And then finally up at the top here, oh, I've got a couple of other things. Some styling here for the bottom of the little accordion folds there, and an adjustment layer for that. And then finally some overall color styling to darken it down and make it look a lot richer. So that was the transformation there. We're not going to use any of that in this project here. We're going to go back and use the radio faceplate that I started out with. But since I used this picture as the poster frame for that video and also for the main image on the page of the blog post, I wanted to show you how I went about that just really quickly, just to kind of give you a sense of what's possible there. All right, I'm going to close this file down here, and I'm not going to worry about saving that. And let's just go back to this file right here. So now I'm ready to prepare this to bring in to my video composite. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a copy of this and crop it down, because I don't need all this empty space down here at the bottom that was in the original composite. So I'm just going to turn off the background layer so we have transparency there. And I'm going to choose Select All, Command A or Control A on Windows. And then I'll copy that. And in order to copy all of the layers, and not just the currently active layer, because the currently active layer here is just this cover panel, in order to copy all of the layers, I'm going to use a special shortcut, Command-Shift-C or Control-Shift-C. Now what that shortcut is for is if I come up to the Edit menu, it basically is going to allow me to copy merged, to copy the merged result of all of the visible layers. And that's what I want here. So I'll choose Copy Merged. And then I'm going to come to the File menu. I'm just going to choose New. And it is automatically going to inherit the size of what I just copied. So I'll just choose OK there, and then I'll choose Paste to paste that down. And you can see now if I turn the background off, this white background, that it is indeed surrounded by transparency. And in fact, I do not even need this background. I'm going to throw it away in the trash. All right, there we go. And let me save this here in our project folder. And it looks like we already are in the project files. And I'll just call this Radio version 1. And I'm going to save that as a Photoshop file. And I'll choose OK and save that. All right, so now I'm going to close that down. I'm going to leave this file open here. This is our layered file that has all of the layered elements, just in case I need to come in and make some other changes once we get this working inside our video composite. So let me deselect the selection here, just so I don't inadvertently make a mistake with that. All right, now it's time to move on to the video compositing part of this project. I'm going to come out to my project files folder for this video composite project. And the first thing I want to do is open up the main little video clip that is kind of the foundation for this whole thing. Let's double click on that to bring it up in QuickTime. And let me make sure that my volume is turned down here because we don't need to hear the sound. So let me just sort of set the stage for you what's going on. So I have this funky, high-tech communication console set up. Made up of an old phone, part of a hard drive, and an old drive-in movie theater speaker. Back from the days when I used to be a drive-in movie theater projectionist. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, as the saying goes. And then behind that, I have this white poster board there. And so my idea when I filmed this was that I would replace everything on this vertical piece of white poster board with something else. And that something else is going to be that composite of the funky old radio that I created a few weeks ago, except in the center of the radio, let's go back to Photoshop here. In this center part here, we're going to replace this radio dial with kind of a television screen and some staticky video. So that is the whole idea there for what is going on. Now let me just play the video so you can see what's happening. So there's just a few instances where my hand reaches in to dial the phone here, and I was just using different numbers so I could get a different duration of the dial. And I was actually hoping that it would stick, because sometimes the dial would stick. And you can see there it is, it sticks, and that allows me to kind of tap it to jar it loose. I kind of like the fact that it's stuck there just because it's a nice little idiosyncrasy of this old phone. Now the important thing to realize about what's happening here is that the action of my hand coming in and dialing the dial, that is totally separate and distinct from the area up above where I'm going to place the composited element. So that is an important concept here, because when you're doing video compositing in Photoshop, you don't really have the ability to mask out around motion video like you do in a program such as After Effects or maybe Premiere Pro or something like that. So you have to keep the action areas of the video separate from the areas where you want to place the composited elements that you're going to add in. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind there. The other thing to keep in mind about the way I have this little still life set up here that I'm interacting with in the video is that the edge of my high-tech communication console here is very distinct from the white poster board behind it. So it's going to make it fairly easy for me to go in and create an accurate mask of the edges of the phone and the receiver there and then the speaker. Alright, so that's a rundown of what was going on here in this video clip. And what I'm going to do now, let me just close this down. I'm going to open that video clip up into Photoshop, and I'm just going to take that here and drag it down onto the Photoshop icon in my dock on my Mac here, and just drop it on top of that icon to open up that video file. Now, I could, of course, have just gone up to the File menu and chosen Open and navigated to where that file is. Or, if I had chosen to open up a blank, empty Photoshop canvas that was sized to the same size as that video file, I could have come here to the Timeline panel, and I could have clicked on this little film strip and just chosen Add Media to add it in there. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to before we get started is that Photoshop has placed our video clip here inside a video group. And I don't really need to have this inside of a video group for this project. Video groups are good if you have clips of video that are meant to be arranged sequentially. So one after the other, etc. For our purposes here in this project, we're not going to be working with any sequential video. So I'm just going to take this layer here and I'm going to drag it up out of the group, and then I'm going to throw the group away because I don't need that. And I'm going to double click on this video clip layer, and I'll just call that main clip. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. Let's come down here and move the timeline panel down, and let me put this into full screen mode so I can get my grabber hand and move this around. And the first thing I want to do is I think I need to have a little bit more room at the top, because right now I don't have a lot of room to position in our steampunk radio or strange steampunk TV is what it's going to end up being. So I'm going to get my move tool and I'm going to drag this layer down here just a little bit, maybe down about, I don't know, maybe about 75 pixels or something like that. You can see I have that nice little heads up display right by my cursor, which is showing me how many pixels down I'm moving this. So right down about 75 looks pretty good. Right to where the bottom edge of the phone is right there at the bottom edge of the picture. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is I want to make a still layer of this scene right here. Because if I move the playhead here, this little blue slider on the timeline panel, you can see that my hand is coming in and interacting with the phone. Well, I'm going to create a mask to where we only are seeing this part of the video where my hand is coming in, and everything else is going to be static. So in order to do that, what I want to do is create a still version of this. So I'm just going to choose Select All, which is Command A or Control A on Windows. And then I'm just going to choose Command J or Control J to float that up. And you can see we have a still layer here. And we can tell that this is not a video layer because it doesn't have this little film strip icon here. Let me actually make my layer thumbnails a bit bigger so it's easier for you to see. I'm going to just right click down in the empty area here in the layers panel and just choose large thumbnails, and that way you can see that a little bit better. And I'll just call this still of video clip. All right. So down here in the timeline panel, I want to make the length of this still of the video clip layer the same length as the entire clip. So I'm just going to put my cursor at the end of this video, or rather the end of this layer in the timeline panel, and just stretch it out to where it snaps down to the end of the other clip. So what I have going on here now is I have a video clip, which you can see by the little film strip icon, and then I just have a regular layer of a photograph, which is a copy of the non-action part of that video. Now, before we get any further about dealing with the video stuff, let me just direct your attention to a previous episode of TheFIX that was released on November 10th in 2015, and in that episode I kind of go over the basics of editing video in Photoshop. So if you are interested in learning more about that, maybe just sort of more traditional sequential video editing, creating a short little movie or a short little clip about something, maybe an experience or whatever, or an event, head on over to the website, thisweekinphoto.com/TheFIX, and go back through our past episodes and find episode number 039 for a more of a basic overview of video editing in Photoshop. Today's project is more about compositing with video clips. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I want to add a layer mask to this still of the video clip to where we're only seeing the top part of this, where I'm going to end up placing the radio. So to do that, let me get my quick selection tool. And the reason I'm using my quick selection tool is that the tonal and contrast differences between the elements of the phone and the speaker and such are different enough from the white background that I can easily drag over those elements to select them. And so that's the reason I'm just using the quick selection tool. And this initially is going to be a quick selection, as the name of the tool might suggest, just so I can rough it out and see what's going on. I'm not going to worry about making it super perfect right now. I mean, we'll make it as good as I can, of course, but I'm not worried about making it a pristine selection or mask. And if you'll recall, the main area where the action is just here over the dial of the phone and the bottom part of the phone, of course. And there are some instances where my hand and wrist kind of extends over the speaker a little bit. So let me just continue dragging over this. Now the nice thing about the quick selection tool is that when you make an initial selection with it, it automatically switches into add to mode. I've got a little bit here that I've selected where I don't want selected, so I'm going to hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows to subtract that. Notice that I also made my brush a lot smaller as I went in to subtract that. That's going to make it a lot more accurate. And speaking of subtraction, I'm going to subtract this little bit right here where there's kind of a hole between the edge of the cord and the edge of the hard drive there. And maybe a little bit down there, I'll just subtract that. That I'm not going to worry about getting perfect right now. That looks pretty good. Again, I could come in here and subtract these other little bits between the cord. I don't think it's going to matter too much by the time I get the composite in there, but who knows? We'll just put those in there for now. And I'm going to add in this kind of brass screw fitting here on the side to make sure that that gets put in. I really don't have to worry about anything that's down below this vertical poster board here, because that's just going to be the white of the tabletop. All right, so that looks pretty good for now. And I'm not going to worry about doing any select and mask edge refinements. I'm just going to go with it the way it is here. And I'm going to make sure that that still a video clip layer is active. And I'm going to use a great shortcut here for hiding the selected areas, because that's what I want to do. I want to hide those. Normally, when you come down and click on the Add Layer Mask button in the bottom of the Layers panel, it will create a layer mask which will show the selected areas. So if I turn off that video clip in the bottom, you can see that this is all we're seeing here. But what I want to do is I want to hide the selected areas. So the shortcut for that is to hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows and then click on the Add Layer Mask button. And you see now I have the exact opposite mask. The areas of the phone and the speaker and such are black and everything else is white. So with a mask like this, it's going to allow the motion of the video to show through underneath while I can composite in other stuff up here at the top. So that is the whole point of that mask right there. All right, next let's bring in our radio and start to composite that into the scene. So let me just come out here and just choose File Open, and we'll go to our project files, and there's my radio version 1.psd. So open that up, and I'm just going to choose Select All, and then I'll copy that, Command C, and we'll come back over here to our video composite file that we're working on. I'm just going to paste that down on top there. It comes in way too huge, so let's zoom back out so we can transform this a lot smaller. Now, instead of just transforming it the way it is, I want to turn it into a smart object so that my transformations are non-destructive. So let me just first rename this. I'll just call this, actually it's not a radio anymore, so we'll call it monitor. We'll just call it monitor, because that's what it is. It's a funky steampunk monitor. All right, so now I'm going to right click on that layer there in the layers panel and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now I can resize it smaller. I'm using the shortcut of Command minus or Control minus to make my image much smaller, because I know that once I bring up the transform controls, which I'm going to do by choosing Command T, I need to be able to see those bounding boxes. So let's bring that down a lot smaller there, and then I'll zoom back up by choosing Command plus or Control plus, and now we can see how that's working. Now, in order to see through this as I transform it, I'm going to come over here to the Layers panel. I'm just going to lower the opacity a bit. So I can still lower the opacity even though I am in the transform controls here. And my aim is to just fit this to this vertical edge here. So what I'm going to do is first make it smaller, a little bit smaller. Well, that looks about good. I'm going to have the top of it kind of come off the edge here because I want to be able to see a lot of what's going on in the bottom down there. Oops, I accidentally applied that transformation, but that's okay. It's a smart object. It's not permanent. All right, that looks pretty good for now. So now what I'm going to do, let's zoom up close so you can see this a little bit easier. I'm going to choose Command T again, and I'm going to hold down the Command key, or this would be the Control key on Windows, and I'm going to grab one of my corner handles here. The addition of the Command or the Control key when you drag on a free transform bounding box corner handle is it allows you to freely distort the image. And so I'm going to grab those handles there to distort that, to try to fit that to that edge so we can create a faux perspective effect so it really looks like it is part of that edge there. All right, so that looks pretty good. And let's sort of bring this back up here. I want to make sure that this is not distorted on the top at all, so I am going to kind of bring this down to where it's even on the top. In fact, I think what I'll do is have it be even with the top edge of the picture. That way I know I'm not getting any totally weird distortion, and I'm kind of way out of whack here on the bottom. So let me stretch that back. Now I still have my rulers visible, so I could click in that ruler and drag down a guide if I wanted to have a guide so I could see what I'm doing there. And that way, when I hold down the command key and drag this, I can line this up to where I've got the bottom edge is a similar alignment on both the right and the left side. So that looks pretty good. Let's kind of pull this up a bit on the top middle handle. That's starting to look a little bit better. And then the other thing I'm concerned about is I don't want too many of these controls here hidden behind the phone. A little bit of it being hidden is okay, but I don't want everything hidden. So that's fine. Something like that looks good. And it's okay that the top part of that hinge is kind of cropped off a bit. That's fine. That kind of adds to the realism, I think, that it doesn't extend. We don't see the whole thing, that it's cropped off a bit. And we'll come out a little bit more like that. All right, so that looks pretty good. We'll apply that there, and let's set my opacity back to 100%. And now let's start to mask this. So fortunately, I can use the mask that I have already created here for that still of the video clip layer. And I'm just going to copy that layer mask up to the monitor layer. To copy a layer mask, you hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows and just drag that layer mask up onto another layer. And you can see it's made a copy. And right off the bat, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to have to do some modification to this on the edges, but overall that's looking pretty nice there. And let me do one other thing here with this mask. I'm seeing a little bit of kind of light colored fringing around the cradle part of the phone. So I'm going to come up to the Properties panel and I'm going to raise my feather up just a little bit, not much, maybe about a half a pixel, and then I'll come into the Select and Mask button here, which will open up the Select and Mask task space. And instead of modifying a selection, I'm going to be modifying a mask here. And the slider I'm interested in is this Shift Edge slider. If I move this back and forth, you'll see how the fringe along the cradle of the phone here is becoming much less. So that is a really cool way to do that. And also the fringing around the cord for the phone receiver is lessening as well. So that looks pretty good there. I'm going to leave that like that. I've got that set to about plus 40. And again, I can always modify it later. So I'll click OK to apply that. All right, let's modify our timeline again. So since I've added a still layer here, it is not occupying the full length of our clip. So I just want to grab the end of that and stretch that out so it is coming down and occupying the full length of the clip. And then let's actually play this video here. Let's make sure I turn the sound off so we don't hear that. And let's just sort of see what that looks like. Let me hide my guide so we don't have to look at that. And bring this up here, and we'll just click the play button and see what that looks like there. So as it's playing here, there's going to be a little bit of kind of like back and forth there as it's playing, but once we get the composite rendered, we're not going to notice that. Okay, so next I think what we need to do is bring in the next element, which is the staticky TV screen, which we're going to put in the center here. Now I still have a lot of edge work masking to do, but I will get to that a little bit later. But let's bring in that TV and start to really kind of see how this composite is coming together. I'm going to go out to my project files folder and I'm just going to open up this clip called TV Static 24 seconds. And as I did before, I'm just going to drag that down onto the dock to open it up into the Photoshop. Of course, I could just use File Open to bring that into Photoshop. I'm going to press the F key a couple of times to get back to where I can see the tabbed version of the file. And I'm just going to use my Move tool and drag in this clip and drag it up to the tab for my composite and then down into the image. I'll hold the Shift key to center that and just drop it right there. And let's actually put this in its own layer group. So I'll create a new layer group by clicking the folder down at the bottom of the layers panel, and I'll put that inside there. I'll call that group TV static, and we'll just rename this static 1. Now if I look at my timeline panel here and I open up that layer group there, we can see that the static is not continuing across the entire clip, because the clip is about twice as long as the static is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of that layer just by choosing Command J, and I'm going to put this down here and just arrange it on the same track there and snug up the back end of that clip so it's aligned with the end of the rest of the clips. Now, in all probability, I'm only going to be using a very small segment of this scene here where the hand is coming in to dial the phone, but I want to have the static present throughout the whole thing so it's there for whatever instance of that dialing action I choose to use. All right, so let's close that group there in the timeline panel, and let's temporarily turn this off by clicking on the eye icon for that TV static layer, because what we need to do now is create a layer mask that we can add to the TV static layer group that will show the TV static only on the inside here. So let me come out to my shape tool that I used last time on episode 081 for defining the shape there, and let's see if that'll work. I'm still using a radius of 800 pixels because that's what I used 3 weeks ago for this tool. And by the way, that's the nature of the options bar in Photoshop. The settings in the options bar are sticky, which means that they stick around until you come and change them again. So I have this set to be a path here instead of a shape, and I'm just going to click roughly in the center of this and drag out. Once I start dragging it out, I'll hold down the Option key, which will allow me to drag from the center. And I'm just going to roughly define this. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect for what I'm doing here, but something like that looks pretty good. Let's come down a little bit. That's good enough for now. I can always finesse that later. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the Paths panel, and I'll just double click on that to turn it from a work path, which is kind of a temporary entity, into a regular path. And now I'm going to load that up as a selection. I'll hold the Command key down on Mac or the Control key on Windows and click on the thumbnail there. And let me actually, well, I guess that's okay for now. We might modify it later. So now what I'm going to do is turn that TV static layer back on, or not layer rather, but layer group. And I'm going to add a layer mask there. So I'll just come down and click on the Add Layer Mask button in the bottom of the Layers panel, and you can see how that is only showing up in there. Of course, now what I need to do is grab those two layers there. So I'll click on that kind of nested video group that got created, and I'll just move them up like so. And now if I scrub through here, you can see how that static is showing up there. It still looks a bit flat and kind of pasted on top. So there's some work we're going to do here to make it look a little bit more convincing and sell it a bit more. And that's going to involve some shading on the edges to make it look as if it really is recessed, and even adding in a reflection on the top of it so it looks like there's a curved glass screen on the top of it. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to soften this mask by coming up to the feather slider and softening it a bit, because it was very hard edged before. It looked like it was cut out with scissors or an X-Acto knife or something like that. And I am going to also paint away a little bit on the top. So let me adjust my brush here. And I will paint with black at 100% opacity to come along and etch away a little bit of that to show a little bit more of that hinge up there. And that'll look a little bit more irregular and maybe a little bit more convincing. Something like that looks good. And we'll come along and work on the sides a bit as well. And I'm not worried too much about making it perfect at this point in time. My my usual mode of operation is I do very rough masks initially, and I worry about making them perfect a little bit later on. So there we go. Something like that is good for now. I'm going to wait till I get the shading in there and everything to see what it looks like. All right, let's bring in the screen glare element and see how it looks with that. Let me just go up to my File, Open command, and let's go get the screen glare and bring it in. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my quick selection tool to create a selection of that screen area there. That looks good, right about like that. Make sure I get a little bit of that shading along the edge. I'll just copy that, Command C or Control C, and I'll come back to our main composite file. And I'm going to just paste that down on top there. Again, it's too big, and it's also come in the wrong place, so you can see it's underneath here, or actually it's gotten placed inside this layer group here, which I don't want. So I'm going to drag that screen glare layer out. First I will name it so I know what it is, and let's drag it up out of there. So you can see this little box here. That means if I let go, it's going to be placed inside the TV static layer group. I want to come up a little bit more to where I don't see a box, but just a single line, and that means it's going to be on top. And once again, way too big, but I will turn that into a smart object by right-clicking on the layer and choosing Convert to Smart Object. And now I can hold down Option and Shift or Alt and Shift to scale this smaller. So the Shift key there constrains the aspect ratio. The Option or Alt key scales from the center point. And let me turn my opacity down so I can see this in a little bit more convincing way, interacting with the main composite here. And I don't really need to have this fit totally. I'm mainly interested in this glare from the overhead lights that are coming in here. That's really all I need there. And you know, I could scale this a bit smaller if I wanted to, or have it fit the screen better, but I think that looks good. Just something like that. Let's set the opacity back up to 100% here for that layer. And let's just change the blend mode. And the blend mode in question I'm going to use here is hard light, which lets that reflection come through. Now, of course, I could come and choose screen to see if that would look good, but it looks a little bit washed out, kind of milky there. Could choose overlay, but that doesn't really work very well. I think I'm going to leave it set to hard light. That just lets enough of that reflection come through. And now I just need to copy the layer mask from the TV static group up to the screen glare layer. So once again, to copy a layer mask, I'm just going to hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows and drag that layer mask up to the other layer. And now we have that screen glare showing up there, and it just looks a little bit more convincing to have that screen glare going on there. All right, let me do another thing here. I'm going to make the layer mask for the TV static layer active, and I am going to choose Command T to bring up Free Transform, and I'm just going to scale that in a bit, which is going to allow me to bring in a little bit of the actual natural edge shading there in the radio screen. And so that's going to look a little bit better. And bring that up, something like that looks good. And then I'm going to replace the screen glare layer mask because I've just changed TV static. To do that, same drill, Option or Alt drag up onto the existing layer mask, and Photoshop asks if we want to replace it. In this case, I definitely do, so I will just choose to replace that. And so that is looking pretty good. I can see we have a little bit of a problem here in that the top part of the phone cradle is being covered over, so we have to modify this layer mask even further. Now before I modify this layer mask, I'm going to make a copy of it because I might want to get back to what this layer mask looks like before I modify it.
So I'm going to have that layer mask active. I'll go to the channels panel and you can see there it is, this TV static mask. I'm just going to drag this down to the new channel icon to make a copy of it, and that is now a backup copy. So I'll click back up on RGB and go back to the layers panel. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up a selection of the edge of the phone here. And I already have that in a layer mask down below for both the monitor and the still of the video clip layer. So I'll command click on one of those to load that up as a selection. And I'm going to inverse this selection by coming up to the select menu and choosing inverse, Shift Command I or Shift Control I if you like to do it from keyboard shortcuts. And now I have a selection of that area. You can see that there. Let's just zoom up a little bit so it's a little bit clearer what's going on there. And now on this layer of TV static, I'll press Option Delete, and that's going to fill with the foreground color, which happens to be black. That shortcut is Alt Backspace on Windows. So I'm filling that selection on the layer mask with black, and you can see how that is bringing in the edge of the speaker and the cable here of the phone and the top part of the cradle. Let's just undo that. We can see how that is working. Looks really good. And I will now turn on the screen layer and do the same thing to that. Just choose Option Delete to bring that in. And now I can deselect. And that is looking a lot more convincing now that we have that going on there. Okay, a little bit more housekeeping to attend to here. I just noticed that the layer for the screen glare does not extend across the entire length of our clip, so I'm just going to grab an end there of each end and stretch it out so it does extend all the way. And I'm also noticing that there's some color up there in the screen glare layer, a little bit of bluish tint that I really don't like, so I'm just going to desaturate that. I'll just choose Command U or Control U to bring up hue saturation, and I'm just going to dial the saturation down. So there we go. That looks a lot better there. So that's about as far as I'm going to be able to get on this live demo version. But what I want to do is switch over to an earlier version that I made a week or so ago, where I took it a little bit farther, and I'll show you what it was that I did to finish this off. So here's the other version that I made, and the first thing that I did was I started, once I got the basic composite together, I started thinking, well, how does the lighting look here? It's kind of flat and everything's sort of uniformly bright, so we need to modify that a little bit. So I started adding some adjustment layers to darken down parts of the scene here, especially the lower part of the scene, and another one to do a photo filter to kind of change the color balance a little bit, lighten up some elements to just kind of cast a little bit more light on areas that I wanted to draw more attention to. I added a little bit of a contact shadow underneath the monitor back there, the pseudo steampunk monitor. And then I also darkened down the bottom part of it quite a lot because I thought, well, if these elements, the speaker and the phone and whatnot, were really in front of this, it might be a little bit darker back there. I noticed now that my mask edge for the speaker in the original version was very rough because it was just sort of a quick proof of concept file here, so I would have to go back and modify that. And finally, I added an adjustment layer for the screen glare to brighten that up a little bit. I thought that looked a little bit better. And then I also added an overall adjustment layer which darkened down the sides because my aim here is to direct the viewer's attention more into what's happening in the center of the image. And if I come and play this here, let's move this up so we can see a little bit more of it up there. And let me just press the play button here. So you can see that we have the static going, and then the hand is going to come in and dial. It's moving really slow now because it hasn't built up a RAM preview yet, and that's what this blue line is here. Wherever it is blue, it's built up a RAM preview. So if I stop this and move the playhead back to the beginning, it's going to play a lot faster. So there it is playing more at normal speed. So that is the basic effect. Now this is a really simple video composite, again, because we have very distinct areas where we're placing the video. We have the video of the static inside the brass frame there of our screen, and then of course we have the video of my hand coming in and dialing the phone, which is separate from everything else. So when you're doing video compositing in Photoshop, these are some of the rules that you have to adhere to. You don't want to have overlapping motion video like the hand coming in, because you really can't do motion masking or rotoscoping as it's called in Photoshop the way you can in After Effects. So one thing that I didn't have time to cover in this episode was how to take your Photoshop video project that you've created and render it out into video format that you can upload onto the web or perhaps use in an entirely different video project. But fear not, because I do have that information ready for you to view right now should you choose to. All you have to do is go to that episode that I mentioned earlier in the show, the one from last November, episode 39, Video Editing in Photoshop. And towards the end of that episode, I do cover the render video dialog, which tells you how to get your video projects out of Photoshop and into a video format that is shareable on the web or usable in other projects. Well, I hope you found that useful and enjoyable and interesting information. I hope that it gives you some ideas for how you might use these Photoshop video compositing techniques on your own projects. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, the great thing about working with video in Photoshop, even though it's by no means a full-fledged video editor at all, but the great thing about working with video in Photoshop is that you can leverage what you already know about Photoshop. So if you already have a good foundation of how to work with things like selections and layers, layer masks, smart objects, blend modes, etc., you can really get up and running pretty quick working with video in Photoshop. So if you haven't tried out any video compositing, I hope that this episode inspires you to do so. You'll probably have a lot of fun and maybe even create some cool stuff. So definitely check it out. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of TheFIX. And indeed, it brings me to the end of my tenure as host of TheFIX. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I would just like to thank everybody who has tuned in and listened to or viewed the show. I do appreciate that very, very much. And again, I also want to thank Frederick Van Johnson and thisweekinphoto.com for allowing me the opportunity to host this podcast for the past year. And once again, if you have not yet checked out some of the other podcast offerings at thisweekinphoto.com, definitely do so. A lot of great shows that are very worthwhile to watch or listen to. So you can always find me at my website, SeanDuggan.com, and there's buttons there on the homepage for all the usual social media channels. And as I sign off here, I just want to leave you with some words that I always pass on to the students of my digital imaging classes at the end of every semester. Since we deal with pixels as the underlying structure of our digital images, I will bid you farewell by saying, go forth and pixelate.